Hello everyone and welcome to this Ranger 4 webcast. Today's webcast will look at DevOps Patterns. If you have any questions during the session, please enter them in either the question or chat feature and we will ask them at the end. The webcast will be brought to you by Helen Bill, Head of DevOps at Ranger 4. For now, I'll pass you over to Helen.
Thanks, Tej, and good afternoon and good morning to everyone on the call today. As Tej said, I'm Helen, and today I'm going to be talking about DevOps patterns. So for those of us that have worked in the software development market for some time, you'll probably use this mantra that I use quite a lot of people, process, tools. So what we're really saying here is that we need to get the right people in the right roles in the right organisational structure before we can start defining and documenting processes and deciding what things look like. And when we've got all that straight, we can finally look at implementing tools to support those processes. There's lots of my customers actually that make the point that actually a process cannot be fully optimized without a tool, which I think is important as well. But for the world of DevOps that we're in these days, I've updated this mantra slightly. So I like to talk about culture, interactions, and automation as my 3 steps to getting stuff done. So I thought today, I'm talking about DevOps patterns, that we would take this approach and look at some patterns in these 3 different areas in the right order. So to begin with, I wanted to look at culture and in particular how changing organisational structure and what patterns we can use in organisational structures can influence cultural change and behavioural change. So this is typically, this is an example of what we typically see in organisations that have been around sort of more than a decade and that haven't really got IT as their core competency. So what you typically see is we've got a CIO at the top, and then we've got effectively 2 large silos, development and operations, quite separated from the business. The CIO not always on the board. Sometimes we have CIOs reporting into FTDs, and we have seen quite a lot of change of recent years as IT has become more strategic. And then we see a number of separate silos within these areas as well. So typical examples of that you can see, and there is some debate over whether PMO always sits under development or whether it's a separate organisation. Some people also have CTO offices and things like that. But this illustrates that we have these silos. What typically happens as we go through the development and delivery process of an application is that handoffs happen between these silos, and that's where often problems come in. It's often where we find bottlenecks, delays, confusion, consternation. And we talk about this wall of confusion, and that's really between development and operations themselves. So we're talking about DevOps, and what I wanted to kind of explain here is that DevOps is a relatively new term. What I've got here is a screenshot I took earlier on Google Trends of DevOps as a search term. So you can see that it only sort of really started taking off as a search term sort of about 2010, and has rapidly grown in interest over recent time. But where it's coming from and why it has so much currency as a term today is really about where the market is today. Because just skipping back a few slides, let's remember that this structure that we have here, this siloed structure, this organisational structure, has worked very well for lots of organisations for many years. So what's changed? Why has DevOps become such an important and well-used term? And why is that organisational structure increasingly viewed to be broken? Well, there's a few things that have changed in the market. One is the importance of digitisation for businesses. So all organisations, whether you're a retailer or an insurer, are increasingly finding that consumers want to, whether consumers be a traditional individual consumer like ourselves or a business-to-business type environment, we're increasingly finding that people want to consume services over the internet. So digitisation is becoming strategic to every business, and it is also becoming a competitive differentiator. So this means that we have an environment where businesses are putting lots of pressure on IT departments and developers in particular to push through change. On the other side of that wall, we have the operations people who in these larger, more established organisations often have IT infrastructure that has evolved steadily over several decades, and they've been through patches of doing things like SOA and e-business, and they've perhaps got different pockets of technologies in there. So we see a lot of complex heterogeneous environments where we might have .NET and Java and multiple flavors of Java, lots of different databases, lots of different integrations and third-party apps that they're calling out to. So very complex and fragile IT infrastructures and lots of change being tried to push through them. And because these guys traditionally haven't talked to each other because they've been siloed, this causes a lot of conflict. So we hear things like developers saying it takes operations way too long to get me an environment. Operations will say things like, development don't give me enough warning that they want to see a new environment, and furthermore they're asking for access to production systems that they shouldn't have at all. We have lots of instances where somebody wants to make a new release and everyone has to come in on the weekend because they're also worried that it's not going to work. We have instances where lots of organisations have either physical war rooms or the virtual capability to pull together a war room when they get an outage. And as I always say, the very term war room doesn't sound very healthy to me. So this is why people are starting to think about DevOps and why this traditional organisational pattern that we've seen is no longer as popular as it was, and people are trying to find ways of breaking it and making something new that works better for them. So where DevOps often starts is as grassroots thinking, and again, referring back to that Google Trends chart, the term DevOps was a hashtag on Twitter, DevOps Days, originally by Patrick Dubois. It means a lot more than it says just in that word, but I think the fact that it's a very catchy word and it's got a lot of currency now around it, so there's a lot of kind of theory and things and philosophies around it, but as a word it works very well. And what happens is everyone's different, and there's always some people that are quite change oriented, can see through problems, and they hear about this DevOps thing, and it often starts as a grassroots thought or movement in organisations that we work with. So one or two people, and I put the little green man who's signifying our DevOps take up here in testing, and we do often see DevOps interest coming out of the testing department. I think that might be because they often feel in the middle a bit between development and operations. But we do see it equally coming out of both sides, dev and ops, and all sorts of different areas. Areas that we don't see so much of it coming from is perhaps PMO and security that aren't perhaps thinking that way so much. And then DevOps spreads out, so these like-minded people start talking to other like-minded people, and they start perhaps going to events and maybe downloading some quick tools that can give them some quick wins. But for DevOps to really make a serious advance into an organisation, it does need some quite high-level sponsorship for a couple of reasons. One, it needs to be mandated, so everyone in the organisation needs to understand that it's something that they should be doing or thinking about, and that should often manifests itself as specific goals being set in development plans. And the other thing is that, like anything that's going to deliver value, it often requires some investment. That could be investment around hiring new resources, training existing resources, perhaps buying some external consulting advice or some tooling to help move things forward. So now we've got the head of development on board, and we've got a few other people getting on board with the DevOps thinking. The next step really is around maybe making some organisational change. And DevOps we see are very much hand in hand with Agile, and this is kind of an Agile organisational change as well. So what we're seeing a lot of, very common thing, is arranging the teams around, the development teams around a product rather than a project, or rather than those skill sets that we saw earlier on. And this has several advantages. It brings the business closer to IT, so it embeds the business in there. So theoretically, we should be acquiring better requirements, and there should be more clarification through that requirements process. It doesn't come without its disadvantages, though. A few things that we've noticed that are possible to mitigate, but one thing is that the knowledge sharing or the collaboration between the particular skill set, so for example testing, tends to break down. This causes problems in terms of sharing best practice. So then what we see is fragmentation in terms of process maturity and again around tooling in the particular product teams. And one of the other slight issues is that the red people here, who denote the product owners or the business people, they quite often don't have a software background or an IT background, and they perhaps don't understand Agile development as well, and we see them often pushing the development teams towards not delivering the iterations that they're going through their sprints to deliver, but actually bundling up larger releases, which kind of doesn't help us do continuous delivery and is a bit of an anti-pattern in terms of what we're trying to achieve. So what we've done here is we've rearranged the development team. So we've now got testers in each team, developers in each team, BAs, DBAs in each team. So another thing that we see quite a few organisations do is change the names of their teams. So a typical one or a common one is change and run. So here works quite well. And you can't just change the name of the team on its own, though. It needs to kind of happen alongside other change. So it would be a bit silly, perhaps. People might find it a bit peculiar if they went into work one day and they just changed team. But it can support change, and it can kind of breathe new life into organisations that are perhaps feeling a little bit fatigued or apathetic. And this is one of the really valuable things that we say a lot to people around DevOps when we're trying to define it as a term. It's like, ultimately, it doesn't kind of matter what it means, as long as it means that it's driving continuous improvement within an organisation. And if all it's doing is inspiring people to try and do things better, then that can't be a bad thing. So another organisation pattern we see quite a lot is this one. So the operations team are now getting on board. You can see run's gone green and happy and excited. So what often happens is the ops team then decide, or it's decided that a DevOps team is going to be built. Now, typically in the industry, the DevOps kind of thinking this is seen as an anti-pattern because we've just created another silo between the two teams effectively. However, it can work as a migration strategy, and certainly within larger enterprise organisations, we have seen this work where a sort of tiger team is set up and that information is then disseminated through all the other teams. And then we have this strategy here, which works extremely well, which is where we embed the operations people into the product development team. So we're effectively kind of shrinking the size of the operations team and putting those guys into the product teams that we've got over there. So this makes some people nervous because I've just said the word shrinking and people don't like their team shrinking. It also is sometimes putting people right into the team where they might feel quite combative if they haven't had a very good collaborative experience with these people before, but it is a very effective way of making change. Some of you may have heard the phrase no-ops as well, and we'll come back to that in a few slides, but operations tasks and controls and ITIL and things and security are always going to be essential. So I personally absolutely believe that no-ops is an anti-pattern, but there is something else that we might call it, I guess, at some point. So then what happens is DevOps continues to proliferate. Hopefully, we've got the CIO on board at this point, the business is getting closer and all of the teams are getting on board. Some of the programs that we run are around helping people like the product owners get on board with Agile a bit more effectively. So we do things like DevOps simulations and gamification to help non-IT people understand what we're doing when we're delivering software and why all the component parts are important and why iterations work best in terms of getting what the customer needs to the customer fastest. So DevOps is an evolutionary and transformational movement, so we're gradually seeing people get on board. But not everybody can change. So we have a lot of conversations with people about what to do about these people that either can't or won't change. And there is this phrase that was said to me yesterday in a conversation I was having about DevOps. I don't actually know who originally said it, so if anyone does, if you could pop it in the chat thing, that would be great. But if you can't change people, change the people. This is quite a brutal approach, and nobody that I know enjoys terminating anyone else's employment. But we did have a customer in some training that we were doing last week that was talking about his approach to doing this sort of change. And he made the, I think, extremely valid point that if you give people plenty of warning that the change is coming and that they need to be part of it, and they choose not to be part of it, then they're choosing not to be part of the organisation. So even though you might have to give them a nudge, they're basically saying they want to be somewhere else. So a little reading recommendation here for you. We do a lot of work with organisations talking about cultural change and motivational attitudes. This book I particularly enjoy. I think the subtitle is a little bit misleading for what I enjoy it for, but David Rock is basically into neuroscience. There is a reward system that you're probably familiar with in the brain that is triggered when we have behaviours that we like and dislike. So David Rock has this theory around something called SCARF. So the idea is that each of us has a primary motivation at work, whether that be status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, or fairness. And when we are rewarded for doing well in those areas, we feel great. And when somebody attacks those areas, for example, if you are quite autonomous and somebody tries to micromanage you, you will have a adverse reaction. So you'll produce cortisol and other neurochemicals that will make the experience unpleasant. I bring this up because if we're trying to do cultural change, if we're trying to get people on board that aren't immediately going, yeah, I love the sound of DevOps, I totally want to do that, and where do I start? Then we need to understand why people aren't perhaps motivated in all the same ways. So here's some kind of idea of DevOps Nirvana. So everyone's green and happy, and everyone's into DevOps. CIO's firmly in the board. And IT is the business. Everyone is on board with that way of thinking, and as you can see, we've kind of done away with this idea of DevOps completely, and we've got this kind of idea of digital innovation management going on. So everything is collaborative and shared, and everyone is handing off nicely and in an automated manner where possible. So here's another reading recommendation for you on this subject that I have just been reading myself. It's quite interesting. It talks about the evolution of organisations. So we kind of go back to what they call these kind of pathological organisations that are ruled by fear, so things like the mafia, and then the evolution into more hierarchical, dictatorial, role-based organisations like the military. Then moving into more capitalist, meritocratic organisations like the current corporate models that we often work with, and then moving into kind of this next stage, which is a bit more Ben and Jerry's, where we've got kind of more people influencing and having ideas and executing ideas from the roots of the organisation all the way up. So not necessarily strategy down, but strategy up. So moving on to the second part of the patterns that we're talking about today. So we're talking about some interaction patterns, so particularly around collaboration and integration. So this is our DevOps maturity model that we use at Range 4. Some of you on the call may have seen it before. And what we tried to do here is distill as far as we could kind of 5 levels of DevOps maturity. So that you can see the kind of patterns we're aiming for here. If we look at level 4, we're looking at a fully integrated tool chain where we can preempt failure. So we give people some warning that a system is going to come down and give them some intelligence that it's coming, why it's coming down, and then automating the tests and deployments, so being able to deliver new releases on demand. This is a Gartner maturity matrix for continuous delivery. Again, there's a number of patterns in here. I have a couple of issues personally with this particular matrix, although we do use it a lot because there's a lot of value in it. The first thing I don't like about it is that it doesn't actually incorporate requirements, and this is a big pattern, may be the wrong word, but it's a thing that we see a lot when we go and talk to organisations, a surprising amount. But requirements, of course, are the foundation of everything that we're doing, and quite often organisations haven't got their requirements nailed down yet, and we'll look at a requirements management matrix, maturity matrix, in a bit more detail in a moment. The other thing I'm not sure about on this one is actually the maturity matrix around release management and compliance, which should include deployment as well, in my mind. But again, we'll have a closer look at another one of these maturity matrices in a moment around release and deployment management. So just a quick note on the requirements bit around testing is what we often find is that people come to us and say that they need some testing automation or some testing tooling because they're getting loads and loads of defects, which is one of the key metrics that we do use when we're measuring DevOps. But what we often find is that the defects are actually coming from poorly written or poorly elicited requirements, and if we can nail that, as I said, kind of foundational area, it automatically reduces the number of defects, which perhaps would be better described as poor requirements. So this other maturity matrix here is around calms. So any of you familiar, which I hope many of you are now, around DevOps will have heard of calms. So John Willis originally came up with CAMS as kind of 4 components essential to DevOps thinking, so culture, automation, measurement, or metrics and sharing. Just Humble from ThoughtWorks added the L for lean later. So again, what we're looking here on this matrix is looking at ways of identifying patterns that signify maturity in a DevOps environment. And virtually no organisation we talk to hasn't done something that could be called DevOpsy. So even if they haven't got a DevOps project, people are typically trying to automate bits of their process. They're typically trying to make cultural change. They're typically trying to identify and fix bottlenecks and streamline processes. As I said earlier, if DevOps is a label that is attached to that improvement activity, then that's all good. So I mentioned this a moment ago, just having a think about kind of requirements management and when requirements management looks really mature. So surprising amount of lack of consistency or coherence in organisations sometimes between teams on how they gather requirements and what methods they use to articulate those requirements. So at level 2 here you can see we've got consistent formatting as something that we're aiming for, and then moving up to level 3 we're starting to talk about different types of requirement. This is really important actually, and one of the ways in which ops can feel neglected or not treated as well as they could be in the software delivery process is when NFRs or non-functional requirements are not incorporated into the software design early enough. So we talk a lot about shifting left. Shifting left often means testing earlier, but it can also mean doing things like incorporating NFRs into the software design earlier. Sounds fairly straightforward to do. You know, one thing you could do is get ops at your Monday stand up and get them visibility and incorporate the NFRs in there. Sounds fairly straightforward. We do have some customers that are geographically dispersed though. I was talking to one in Denmark yesterday who has dev and ops in the same town, but they're about 1 kilometre apart in different buildings. I've been to buildings where dev's on one floor and ops is on one floor, and another customer one's been on one side of the corridor and the other side of the corridor. But we do have other organisations where actually their dev team is in London and some of their ops team might be in Sri Lanka or in Chennai. So that makes it a little bit more difficult to do. However, we can use some collaborative tooling there. We'll come on to tooling in a bit more detail in a few moments. So where we're really ending up with requirements maturity is actually fully integrating it to test. So I mentioned this link between requirements and defects earlier. We should be able to track requirements through into our testing scripts. The other important note to make here, I'm just going to flip back for a second to the previous slide. So if we look at level 4, optimizing and measurement, and it says measure to customer value here. I like to call this measuring feature value, or as one of the customers in training last week said, the aha to ka-ching moment, which I really enjoyed as well. So it's this concept of being able to say, right, we had that idea, it cost us this much to get it to market, and while it's been in market, it's been making us this much money or this much difference to our income. And we can't do that if we haven't integrated our tools, and we haven't got requirements integrating into test, and we haven't got tests implementing through to our CD and continuous deployment platforms. This is the other maturity matrices that I wanted to share with you today, which is around release and deployment maturity. So these patterns here. Typically, this is a really big bottleneck area, typically because if you look at level 1, we've got this manual process here. So I've been working with organisations where they have been deploying apps onto quite complex composite environments, and somebody in their outsourced release team has needed to build a web application server, and to do that they have had a 140-page book to go through. So not only is that really onerous and boring, it's also really quite dangerous and prone to error. So what a lot of people start doing is, and also it's a really boring job manually building systems all the time. What we often see is that it's really clever people, because a lot of us that work in IT are quite clever, really clever people trying to do releases, which is a really boring and monotonous task. So they're sat there doing yet another manual configuration of this thing, and they think, oh, I could write a script for that. So they write a script for that, and they write more and more and more scripts until they've got what I like to call a script monster, and they're the only person that can control this monster. So when something is being deployed, and this is a big cause of this release weekend scenario where everyone has to be on tenterhooks, worrying about whether this release is going to happen, and if it breaks, then it's typically this person that's written all these scripts that is the hero that comes in and saves the day, but actually isn't really a hero because the scripts are the problem, and he's also a bottleneck because it's the only person that can fix this problem. So we really want to get away from that anti-pattern in DevOps and towards the pattern where we can deploy on demand. So we have systems that allow us to do it like breathing, or as someone said to me the other day, as if we're driving on snow. I assume this if we lived in Scandinavia, because in the UK driving on snow is very scary. I quite often like to talk about an experience I had when I flew to Iceland last year for a few days holiday, and the pilots came on board and announced that we were starting to make our descent and that there was a blizzard on the ground in Reykjavik, and they hoped that we would be able to land, which alarmed me for a moment until I realised they were probably joking, and the rascals probably landed in blizzards at least 50% of their time getting back to their home airport. So that's where we're trying to get to. So let's talk a bit more about automation. It's nicely led into that. So I wanted to take the pattern view of creating rigor and ruggedness around our businesses using automation. And just kind of referring back to what we were saying earlier about the problems that we sometimes see or experience where we have rearranged development around our product lines, as we have done here. And then this kind of tools fragmentation. So what tends to happen is each team is then doing their daily work on their own, and they come up with an idea and they think, oh, I'll just download something to help with that. And before we know it, what you can see here is we might have one product team using Team City for build, and another Go, and another Jenkins, another RTC. We might have one team using Puppet for orchestration, another one messing about with Chef, another one loving Ansible. And that doesn't give us economies of scale. It doesn't enable us to collaborate effectively. It doesn't enable us to share best practices. So some things need to happen there, really around identifying the standard tools that are wanted to be used across the organisation, and it's an opportunity here for operations to provide shared services or infrastructure as services to their customer as their internal IT people. There was another couple of comments I wanted to make on this actually, which I don't really have a slide to explain today, but I'll try and explain it in words. So we're going, I think, through a kind of phase of a DevOps toolchain 2.0 I'm seeing in a lot of customers now. So when we looked at the maturity scale a few slides ago, this one, I think one of the comments I'd have here is we don't see many customers at level 5 at the moment. I think some very small new startups or the larger very IT-oriented firms might consider themselves up here. We also see very few people at level 1 now as well. As I said, almost everybody is doing something, whether they're calling it DevOps or not. It's DevOps-like activity. So where we're seeing most people is around levels, somewhere between level 2 and 3 at the moment. So that means people have started to build tool chains, and they have started often at the grassroots level. And as you all know, we've just been through a global recession, so a lot of organisations, but most organisations have been very constrained from a resources perspective, so from a people perspective and also from a budget perspective. So what we've seen is quite a big proliferation of open source software in organisations, and quite a few people have started to build continuous delivery tool chains or DevOps tool chains using open source software, like some of the examples that we have on this page here, which makes perfect sense when you don't have any money or a business case that's been approved to make investment in an enterprise level tool. However, it does come with a number of problems. So what we're seeing now is these CD pipelines are becoming very core to what is increasingly the critical part of the business, as we discovered earlier, which means there's now some risk being built into the organisation by using things that are open source, and that comes in a number of different ways. One, who do you call for support when it's broken? Two, a lot of open source pieces of software have licenses agreements in them that mean if you use them in certain ways, they're no longer open source. And also, open source software is not as rigorously controlled and tested for vulnerabilities. As you may expect, there are lots of solutions to these problems. So, as you probably will expect as well, companies like Puppet and Chef and Atlassian that offer free software didn't build their company without VC funding, and those VCs are expecting those companies to make money at some point, and the way that they will make money is by charging for support and charging for enterprise add-ons. So we work with lots of organisations at the moment working out whether it's time for them to bite the bullet and say, look, Jenkins is now giving us this much business value, here's our business case, we need to buy the enterprise version of Jenkins from Cloudbees, or we now need an ARA tool and we need to speak to somebody like IBM about something like Urban Code. And then we also have a kind of new set of products coming out which are giving us more ruggedness around these open source tooling or around DevOps. So things that help us to discover and analyse and report on whether bits of open source platforms we're running are compromising us from a license point of view. Developers are developing in an assembly manner more and more than coding these days, and the component parts that they're assembling from often look open source but might not be, and might also have vulnerabilities in them. So there's also tooling from Sonatype that helps us understand where those gaps and risks might be. And then there's also a whole slew of penetration testing type tools like AppScan that help us automate finding the vulnerabilities in our web applications. So finally, I just wanted to talk about a key DevOps pattern that we are building day to day with our customers, where we're aiming for. So this kind of DevOps Nirvana, where everyone is functioning in a DevOps manner. What we have here is that the route to live. Some people kind of would prefer dev, test, and QA to be represented as a sandbox in the DevOps world, but what we need to know here is that we have a runbook that needs to do a certain number of steps through release and a certain number of steps through deploy, and we have a route to live through different types of environment that ideally we want to look the same, but is sometimes difficult for people to do. We'll come back to that in a moment. So we want to be able to deploy on demand, so whenever that code is ready. So your developers are developing in an agile manner. When that iteration is ready, we want to be able to deliver that innovation to that end user and start realising that value. We don't want to be held up by lots of bottlenecks, either by the product owners wanting to roll things up or by handoffs not happening between teams. And we want that to be automated and consistent and predictable as much as possible. And then we want to be told that something is breaking, so we need some pretty heavy lifting application performance management tooling in there that can give us good warning on whether, when and where a business transaction may be failing, and give us some intelligence about why it's failing to feed back into the team so they can fast fix it. And then what we need to do is be able to redeploy that fixed code very quickly and get it all the way through this route to live, particularly through test and QA. So one of the common problems that we see is that people can't easily build production-like test environments. This usually happens because there's lots of integrations and it's difficult to make replicas of very large data sets, for example, or third-party systems. So integration testing is a really key part of what we do here. We do have a webcast coming up in a couple of weeks if you want to check on our events page, where we will be focusing in specifically on building production-like test environments and how to do that. So that was it from me today. I'm going to check now. We've got a little bit of time for some questions. We've got about another 5 minutes, I think, if anyone has any questions. So I'm just going to have a quick look in the chat panel. and the question panel. So I can see Randy said thank you. Does anyone else have any questions that they would like to put forward at this point? You are all on mute, unfortunately, because there's quite a few of you. But there is a question box on the control panel that you should be able to see. So I don't think we're getting any questions unless somebody is about to ask me something. So I will say thank you very much, everybody, for your time today. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and let us know if you would like to continue this conversation. Speak to you soon. Thanks. Bye.